Welcome to the MCAT Basics podcast, brought to you by the physicians at Med School Coach. Each week, Sam Smith breaks down high-yield MCAT topics so you can score as high as possible on test day.
Hello and welcome to Prospective Doctors MCAT Basics with your host, Sam Smith. The goal of this podcast is to cover the highest yield topics on the MCAT and provide you with some sort of insight into the questions that the MCAT really likes to ask. This podcast covers 3 common hormone axes. I will talk about the hypothalamic-pituitary-adrenal axis, or the HPA axis. I'll talk about the hypothalamic-pituitary-gonadal axis, or the HPG axis. And lastly, I'll talk about the Renin-Angiotensin-Aldosterone System. And if you want to hear about one of these in particular, you can just take a look at the show notes. I have all the timestamps for these different axes on them, so you can kind of skip ahead and listen to whatever part you want. And this material is going to show up on one of the 4 MCAT sections. That's the biochem section. In addition to learning about these different axes, I hope that this is a somewhat helpful review of the endocrine system. And overall, I hope you find this podcast helpful. Before I get into the podcast, I just want to let everyone know that on September 24th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, I will be joining some of my fellow hosts of these different Med School Coach podcasts on a Behind the Mic live episode. It's essentially going to be a YouTube, Facebook live event where we're going to talk about our podcast, our journey in medicine, and some other things like that. So if you want to join, go to go.medschoolcoach.com/podcast. You can kind of sign up early, get some other details. But again, it's going to be a Facebook, YouTube live event, September 24th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. The first thing you're probably wondering here is, what is a hormone axis? And it's a little bit hard to define what a hormone axis is, but essentially it's a set of hormones and organs that influence each other through a complex set of interactions. Basically a system of hormones and organs that work together to accomplish some task. As I said in the intro, I'm going to talk about 3 different axes. I'm going to talk about the hypothalamus-pituitary-adrenal axis, the hypothalamic-pituitary-gonadal axis, and then the Renin-Angiotensin-Aldosterone system. So with that said, I'm going to break these systems down in terms of their anatomy first, just so you can kind of understand some of the different structures that are in the axis. Then I'll talk about the physiology, which is probably the most important thing to know. I'll get into the different hormones, what those hormones look like, and some of the mechanisms by which these hormones act. So let's start with the hypothalamic-pituitary-adrenal axis, or the HPA axis. As its name suggests, there are 3 structures that are involved in this axis: the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the adrenal glands. The hypothalamus is located in the brain. It's a small section of the brain that is located kind of near the middle bottom region of the brain. It sits directly above the brainstem. And it contains a bunch of little nuclei. And these nuclei are just clusters of neurons. I kind of like to think of them as like balls of neurons. And each of these nuclei is involved in regulating a different set of hormones. For example, the supraoptic nucleus produces vasopressin, also called antidiuretic hormone, that is stored in the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. On the other hand, the suprachiasmatic nucleus is involved in the circadian rhythm and stimulates the production of melatonin. And I think overall, the hypothalamus looks a little bit like monkey bread. If you've ever had monkey bread, it's cake made up of kind of a bunch of individual pieces of dough that you bake together to make an overall cake. And it's damn good. And you can kind of pull off the little pieces of dough and eat those individually. But to me, the hypothalamus looks like this because it's made up of all these different nuclei that are all clustered together. So it makes up this structure, right? But the structure is made up of all these little nuclei that individually secrete different hormones. Next, the pituitary is a very small gland that is located right below the hypothalamus and consists of 2 lobes, an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe. And these different lobes secrete different hormones, kind of similar to the nuclei of the hypothalamus. For instance, the posterior pituitary is just an extension of the hypothalamus. So it doesn't actually produce any hormones. It actually just stores and releases hormones that are made in the hypothalamus. And this posterior pituitary is attached to the hypothalamus by this tube-like structure called the infundibular stalk. Essentially, neurons project from these different nuclei of the hypothalamus through the infundibular stalk and then into the pituitary gland, where hormones are then stored and released. Now, on the other hand, the anterior pituitary is a hormone secreting machine. It secretes a bunch of different types of hormones. And what's interesting to me is that each of these hormones that is produced in the anterior pituitary has its own cell type. So, for instance, there's a type of cell that's called a corticotrope, and that produces adrenocorticotropin, or ACTH, which, as you will hear, plays an important role in the HPA axis. So again, the pituitary is this structure that sits below the hypothalamus. It has two lobes, an anterior and a posterior lobe, and each of those lobes have a little bit different functions. Now, the next thing I want to talk about are the adrenal glands. So you have two adrenal glands. They sit on each of the two kidneys, and to me, they look like melted ice cream. So they're just kind of sitting on top of the kidney. They're this white tissue that looks sort of like it's melting. And structurally speaking, the adrenal glands have two regions of interest, an outer region called the cortex and an inner region called the medulla. And just an aside, have you ever wondered where these terms cortex and medulla come from? Because they describe a lot of different organs, right? The kidney has a medulla and a cortex. The brain has a cortex. And so the word cortex is of Latin origin, and it means bark, rind, shell, or husk, hence the outer part of an organ. And then medulla is Latin for the middle, which again, that makes sense. And then lastly, Medusa is the goddess from Greek mythology with snake hair who will turn you into stone. She's really mean. And so the adrenal medulla, which again is that middle part of the adrenal gland, secretes the catecholamines, which are epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. The adrenal cortex, on the other hand, that outer part, secretes what are called corticosteroids. That includes things like aldosterone, cortisol, and androgens. And as you will see throughout this podcast, those three hormones play pretty important roles in each of these three axes. All right, so with some of that anatomy out of the way, let's get into the physiology of this HPA axis. The HPA axis is traditionally thought of as the stress axis. As the name suggests, it starts out with the hypothalamus, and more specifically, it starts out with the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus. The paraventricular nucleus synthesizes and secretes a bunch of different hormones, one of which is called corticotropin releasing hormone, or CRH, and it is really important for this HPA axis. So corticotropin releasing hormone is a peptide hormone. It's 41 amino acids long, and it's secreted in response to stress. So say that you're writing your secondaries and you submit all of them, and now you have to wait months and months for responses for interviews, and the whole time you are releasing this corticotropin releasing hormone. Yes, that is what you have to look forward to after you are done with the MCAT. And of course, you're going to kill the MCAT, but that's what you got to look forward to. Anyway, so this CRH is released in response to stress, and it stimulates the production of hormones in the anterior pituitary. More specifically, it stimulates the production of a hormone that is called adrenocorticotropic hormone, which I will talk about next. But first, let me kind of just recap what's going on in the hypothalamus. So the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus produces and releases a hormone that is called the corticotropin releasing hormone. And from there, that hormone makes its way from this nucleus into the capillary system that connects the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary, where then it travels into the anterior pituitary and binds to its receptor, therefore stimulating production and release of adrenocorticotropic hormone. Okay, so that brings me to adrenocorticotropic hormone and the anterior pituitary. Cells within the anterior pituitary called corticotropes produce adrenocorticotropin, and it's also called ACTH, and I'm going to call it ACTH from now on just because it's a lot of syllables to say adrenocorticotropin. And so these corticotropes are cells in the anterior pituitary that have receptors that bind to this corticotropin releasing hormone that comes from the hypothalamus. And just to do a quick review of what peptide hormones do, remember they are able to travel through the blood pretty easily because they are blood soluble. and they bind to receptors on the surface of a cell and set off a transduction pathway that amplifies that signal and has some effect on that cell. In terms of this hormone that's coming from the hypothalamus that's binding to these corticotropes, it binds to a receptor called CRF1, which is a G protein coupled receptor, or GPCR, and this leads to the production of ACTH. Now, once this adrenocorticotropin, or ACTH hormone, is released, it has a bunch of interesting effects and a lot of different things it does for this HPA axis. And before I go on to those effects, let me just talk a little bit about this hormone. So it's another peptide hormone. It is 39 amino acids long, and it binds to receptors in the adrenal cortex. And this brings me now to the next part of this HPA axis, which is the adrenal glands. So again, the pituitary, the anterior pituitary, produces this ACTH hormone, and then that gets secreted into the bloodstream, where it kind of works its way through the bloodstream till it makes its way to the adrenal glands. Now, once it gets to the adrenal glands, it binds to its receptor on the adrenal cortex called the adrenocorticotropic hormone receptor, aptly named, and from there it stimulates the release of a group of hormones called the glucocorticoids. Now, a little aside for you, this ACTH hormone doesn't just have receptors in the adrenal cortex. There's quite a few other cell types throughout the body that have receptors for this hormone. But since we're talking about the HPA axis, I'm only going to talk about this in the context of the adrenal glands. All right, so back to this group of hormones called the glucocorticoids. There is one hormone in particular that is in this group that is important for this HPA axis, and that is cortisol. You've probably heard of cortisol, and I hope that this is kind of making things come full circle for you, because cortisol is a steroid hormone that is released in response to stress. And if you're like me, you're probably wondering, what exactly is stress? So stress is just the body's response to some stressor, which is typically like a threat, a challenge, some type of barrier. And this can either be physical or psychological. For example, being chased by a rabid dog might be something that's a physical stress, whereas something that's a psychological stress may be something like you woke up in the morning and you realized, oh shit, I was supposed to take my final 2 hours ago, and you have to email your professor, you're in a tizzy, and it's not good. Now, as I said, cortisol is a steroid hormone. And just to quickly review steroid hormones, these are hormones that are unable to dissolve in the blood, so they need a carrier protein to carry them around. And they bind to nuclear receptors, so they are small enough and nonpolar enough that they can diffuse right through the plasma membrane of a cell and go bind actually to receptors in the nucleus and change transcription patterns to produce whatever effect that hormone elicits. Now, cortisol does a few different things in the body. It, number one, stimulates gluconeogenesis, and number two, it stimulates the breakdown of proteins. And interestingly, prolonged high plasma cortisol levels can actually lead to something called the muscle wasting, where you're basically breaking down your muscles and they're getting visibly smaller, they're atrophying. And to me, this says that if you're trying to gain lean muscle and you're lifting weights, running, etc., stress is something that you want to try to stay away from, which is a pretty obvious statement, but it is interesting to see that the mechanism there is that high cortisol levels can lead to the breakdown of muscle. Another thing that cortisol does is it modulates the immune system's responses. Most importantly, it acts as an anti-inflammatory agent. So it essentially turns down the volume on the inflammatory response, which a powerful inflammatory response can actually do damage to tissues. So it kind of helps prevent some of that damage from being done. You've probably seen hydrocortisone cream, which is an anti-inflammatory, anti-itch cream. Its active ingredient is cortisol. And so all of these functions together, the gluconeogenesis, the breakdown of proteins, and this modulation of the immune response is all in preparation for us responding to whatever stress is our environment, right? Glucose or gluconeogenesis is going to give us more energy. Protein breakdown produces products that can feed into this gluconeogenesis pathway and be used to produce energy. And then the inflammatory response is important for protecting us against pathogens, but when there are threats in our environment and we're stressed, that just is going to slow us down. So cortisone being able to tamp down this inflammatory response is going to help us respond to the stressor in our environment better. So far in the HPA axis, we have corticotropin-releasing hormone being produced and released by the hypothalamus, and that moves on down into the anterior pituitary where it stimulates adrenocorticotropin hormone production and secretion. And then this adrenocorticotropin hormone goes around into the blood and makes its way to the adrenal cortex, where it stimulates the production of cortisol. And then cortisol does a bunch of different stuff in the body that prepares us to deal with stress. Now, the last thing I want to talk about here is the negative feedback loop that is integrated in this axis. And this negative feedback loop is part of what makes the HPA axis an axis. So cells in the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary have glucocorticoid receptors, which allows them to actually recognize and respond to cortisol. As a result, cortisol that again is produced in the adrenal cortex can inhibit the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland from secreting their hormones. So basically, cortisol feeds back and reduces the amount of corticotropin-releasing hormone that the hypothalamus produces and the amount of adrenocorticotropic hormone that the anterior pituitary makes. So that's the HPA axis for you. Again, it plays a very important role in the stress response. The next hormone axis that I want to talk about is called the hypothalamic-pituitary-gonadal axis, or the HPG axis. HPG axis involves several important structures, two of which I've already talked about, the hypothalamus and the pituitary. Third, obviously, is the gonads. And I'll go over a little bit of the structure and the anatomy of the gonads, and then I will dive into the physiology of this axis. The gonads are different depending upon whether I'm talking about a male or a female. For males, the gonads are the testes, and for females, the gonads are the ovaries. The testes are two oval-shaped organs that if you were to cut in half, and don't try this at home, you would see a bunch of little coiled tubes inside of. And these tubes are called seminiferous tubules, and they produce cells that eventually become mature sperm cells. And inside these seminiferous tubules, there are cells called Sertoli cells. And what they do is they provide nourishment to the growing and maturing sperm. And in between each of these different kind of sacs of seminiferous tubules, and I just recommend you go Google a picture of this because I had no idea what the inside of a testicle looked like, but it's actually a little bit interesting. Anyways, in between these pockets of seminiferous tubules, there is interstitial space. And inside this interstitial space, there are cells of Leydig or Leydig cells. And they secrete testosterone, which is the main male sex hormone. And as you'll see, these cells are very important for the HPG axis in males. Now, the ovaries, like the testes, are two oval-shaped structures. They sit a little bit higher up inside the abdomen in females than testicles do in males. And this is the site where the egg matures during the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle. And right near the developing egg, there is a layer of cells called granulosa cells. And right outside that layer of granulosa cells, there are another cell type called theca cells. And you'll see a little bit later why those cells are so important. And the ovaries are also where the corpus luteum develops. And right on top of the ovary, there is this hand-looking structure that is kind of like squeezing the ovary from the top. That's called the fallopian tube. And the fallopian tube has, again, it looks like this hand, but off the hand is this long tube coming off of it. And once a month during ovulation, an egg is released from the ovary into the fallopian tube, where if something happens, you know what that thing is, it can be fertilized by sperm. And one thing that I found interesting and something you might be wondering is, okay, well, as I said, there are two ovaries, but there's one egg released each month. Which ovary gets the egg each month? Do they just switch off? Is it one of them all the time? Well, it's actually turns out that it's random. So it's a random process as to which ovary releases an egg each month. But scientists also have noticed that if you were to remove one ovary, the other ovary would produce one egg every month. Kind of interesting. All right, so let's get into the physiology hormone action of this HPG axis. So like the HPA axis, this begins at the hypothalamus. In the HPG axis, the hypothalamus secretes gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which stimulates the production of luteinizing hormone, also called LH, and follicle-stimulating hormone, FSH, in the anterior pituitary. Now let's talk a little bit about gonadotropin-releasing hormone that is created in the hypothalamus. So it is a peptide hormone that is 10 amino acids long, also called a decapeptide, and it's produced by neurons in the infundibular nucleus, which again is one of those nuclei of the hypothalamus. And gonadotropin-releasing hormone secretion occurs in pulses that increase in magnitude and frequency prior to ovulation and throughout puberty for growing males and females. And as you could probably guess, its levels are very, very low until you reach puberty, at which time you start undergoing some of these sex-dependent body changes. And now after this hormone is produced in the hypothalamus, it travels through a portal system into the anterior pituitary where it binds to receptors on cells called gonadotropes. Like the others, this receptor is a gangster protein coupled receptor, or GPCR. And essentially the binding of this gonadotropin-releasing hormone stimulates the production and secretion of two very, very important hormones for the reproductive system, which are, as I said earlier, luteinizing hormone, LH, and follicle-stimulating hormone, FSH. So let's talk about these hormones that are produced in the anterior pituitary, starting with LH. So LH is a protein hormone. It has two subunits, an alpha subunit and a beta subunit, and it has a little bit of different effects depending upon whether we're talking about a female or a male. So in females, luteinizing hormone stimulates estrogen production. And essentially what occurs is that theca cells in the ovary respond to LH stimulation by secreting testosterone, which is then converted to estrogen by adjacent granulosa cells. In addition to this, a luteinizing hormone surge causes ovulation during the follicular phase, which causes a rupture of the follicle and releases the egg from the corpus luteum into the fallopian tube. In males, luteinizing hormone stimulates testosterone production in the testes. Essentially, it binds to receptors on the Leydig cells and stimulates the synthesis and secretion of testosterone. So I think overall you can sum up the action of luteinizing hormone by saying that it stimulates the production of estrogen in females and testosterone in males. Now, follicle-stimulating hormone is similar in structure to LH. It is also a protein hormone that's composed of an alpha and beta subunit, but the effects it elicits are quite different. So in females, it initiates the growth of follicles in the ovary, and its receptors are actually found on the surface of granulosa cells. In males, it supports the function of the Sertoli cells, which, as I said earlier, provide nourishment to the growing, maturing sperm cells. Okay, so just to quickly recap all of that. In females, LH stimulates estrogen production, whereas FSH stimulates the production of follicles. In males, on the other hand, LH stimulates Leydig cells to produce testosterone, and FSH stimulates Sertoli cells to nourish and support growing sperm cells. And that right there should tell you a little bit about the connection between the pituitary and the gonads. As I said, LH and FSH are produced in the anterior pituitary, and they travel through the bloodstream to get to the gonads, where they elicit different effects on the gonads, mostly making them secrete testosterone and estrogen. So that's what I want to talk about next, is these gonads and what exactly these different hormones that are produced in the gonads do. I'll start with testosterone. So testosterone is the main male sex hormone, and it's a steroid hormone, and influences the development of the penis and testes, deepens the voice during puberty, and influences sperm production, muscle size, and also strength. In females, on the other hand, estrogen and progesterone are the two main hormones. Estrogen is secreted by granulosa cells in the ovary, and like testosterone, it is a steroid hormone. And really, it looks pretty much just like testosterone, except for that estrogen, also called estradiol, has an aromatic ring, whereas testosterone has a carbonyl group that the estrogen does not have. Anyways, estrogen has many different effects. For instance, it regulates the menstrual cycle. It plays an important role in developing some of the female characteristics like wide hips and breasts, and it also plays a role in developing the female reproductive tract. Progesterone is a hormone that I have yet to talk about, and it is secreted by cells in the corpus luteum. And like these other two hormones, it is a steroid hormone, and it has many of the same effects as estrogen, like the development of female characteristics. But one other thing that it does is it helps protect and nourish the endometrium. The endometrium is just the innermost lining of the uterus that thickens in order to get ready for an embryo. So what we have so far in the HPG axis is that the hypothalamus secretes pulses of gonadotropin-releasing hormone. This goes down into the anterior pituitary, where it stimulates the production of luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone. And from there, these two hormones are released into the blood, where they act on the gonads and induce production of testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. From there, these sex hormones make their way around the body and exert their different effects, all of which are very important. The last thing I'll mention here, and this is very similar to the HPA axis, is that part of what makes this HPG axis an axis is that there are feedback loops integrated into it. So essentially, testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone can all exhibit negative feedback on the HPG system. What they do is they go bind to nuclear receptors in the hypothalamus and inhibit the secretion of gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which in effect produces less follicle-stimulating hormone and less luteinizing hormone and slows down production of testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. This last axis that I'm going to talk about it's still a really important system to know for the MCAT, and it's also very interesting. It's called the Renin-Angiotensin-Aldosterone System, or sometimes just the Renin-Angiotensin System. And I'm just going to kind of dive into the mechanism here, and I'll stop along the way to talk about these different hormones and molecules that are involved in the system. So within the afferent arterioles of the kidney, there are a specialized group of cells called the juxtaglomerular cells. And these group of cells sit right outside the renal corpuscle and respond to changes in blood pressure. And what allows them to recognize changes in blood pressure is stretch receptors that are located in the membrane of these cells. And so what happens is that when they recognize a drop in blood pressure, they cleave this molecule called prorenin into its active form called renin. And I will say that these juxtaglomerular cells are constantly secreting prorenin. So it's not like they recognize a drop in blood pressure and then produce prorenin, chop it, and release it. It's more of they're releasing the prorenin constantly, they recognize a drop in blood pressure, and then they start cleaving that prorenin into renin, and instead now this renin gets secreted into the bloodstream. And so let me just tell you a little bit about renin. Renin is a hormone and it's an enzyme. So it does have a receptor. It can go bind to a receptor, cause things to happen in cells, but it's better known for its enzyme activity. And it actually has protease activity, meaning that it cleaves proteins. And the protein that is of interest that it cleaves, or I guess interest to us in terms of this system, is a protein called angiotensinogen. And what renin does is it cleaves angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. And all angiotensinogen is a precursor for angiotensin. And I will say that angiotensinogen is produced in the liver. And like prorenin, it's constantly being secreted into the blood. So what happens is that renin comes in contact with this angiotensinogen in the blood and immediately, boom, cleaves it into angiotensin 1. And at this point, you might be wondering, okay, what does angiotensin 1 do? And I think Edwin Starr described it best. He said, "What is it good for?"
Absolutely nothing.
Because apparently angiotensin 1 doesn't do jack. In terms of the system, it's considered physiologically inactive. However, there's an enzyme called angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE, that can convert angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2, which actually does something. And ACE is typically anchored to the plasma membrane of cells in the lungs and kidneys. And you've probably heard of ACE2. That's the receptor that SARS coronavirus 2, which is the virus that causes COVID, uses to enter cells. And so you might be thinking, okay, are ACE2 and ACE, are those related? And the answer to that is yes, kind of, but not in a way that you would think. They actually do the exact opposite. So ACE converts angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2, whereas ACE2 converts angiotensin 2 back to angiotensin 1. So essentially, they're kind of like equal but opposite action, if that makes sense, kind of like a little physics. Anyways, back to angiotensin 2. So angiotensin 2 exerts a shit ton of effects on a bunch of different things. It causes blood vessels to constrict, which is called vasoconstriction. It also acts on the brain in multiple ways. For instance, it stimulates the synthesis of vasopressin in the hypothalamus, and it also acts on the central nervous system to stimulate the sensation of thirst. In addition, it directly increases sodium reabsorption in the proximal tubule. And as I've talked about in other podcasts, and as you should probably know for the MCAT, water likes to follow salt when it's reabsorbed because of osmotic pressure. So as a result of this increased sodium reabsorption, that increases blood volume and increases blood pressure. Then last but not least, this is the biggest one to remember for this system, is that angiotensin 2 stimulates the release of aldosterone from the adrenal cortex. And before I get into aldosterone, I should mention that angiotensin 2 has a very short half-life in the blood. It's somewhere in the 1 to 2 minute range. And essentially what happens is that in a very short amount of time, this angiotensin 2 is cleaved into different products. For instance, angiotensin 3 and 4, or it might be angiotensin 3 and 6. They're labeled with Roman numerals, so I don't think there's any difference between the 4 and the 6 for Roman numerals, so it's hard to tell. Anyways, these angiotensin 3 and 4 are able to stimulate aldosterone secretion still, but they don't nearly have the same systematic effect. So those earlier things I talked about, like vasoconstriction, the increase in sodium reabsorption in the proximal tubule, etc., those things aren't stimulated as much by these products that are angiotensin 3 and 4. So that's kind of interesting and something to keep in mind. But again, the big thing here is that angiotensin 2 stimulates the release of aldosterone, which is what I'll talk about next. Aldosterone is produced in the adrenal cortex, which is the outer part of these glands called the adrenal glands that are located on top of the kidneys. And aldosterone is a steroid hormone, and it is the main mineralocorticoid hormone that is produced in the adrenal cortex. And aldosterone has very specific activity, which is nice, right? Because we've talked about testosterone and estrogen that have these kind of wide-ranging actions that are kind of difficult to define, really. Well, this one has a very specific activity. So it acts on nuclear mineralocorticoid receptors within the cells of the distal tubule and collecting duct of the nephron. And as I've mentioned a little bit, steroid hormones are able to actually diffuse through the plasma membrane fairly easily. And as a result, they have receptors that are actually in the nucleus of cells. So these receptors that I'm talking about that are in cells in the distal tubule and collecting duct are nuclear receptors. And when aldosterone binds to these nuclear receptors, it stimulates these cells to produce more membrane sodium channels. And so what happens then is more membrane sodium channels are produced. Those go to the plasma membrane. They're inserted in them. And then this causes the cells in this part of the nephron to reabsorb more sodium. And what does that do? As we've learned, water follows that sodium, and that increases the blood volume and the blood pressure. So overall, the end goal of the Renin-Angiotensin-Aldosterone system is to increase blood sodium levels and increase blood pressure. And just to give the briefest, most succinct summary I can, what occurs in this system is, number one, prorenin is cleaved to renin. Renin makes its way into the blood where it meets up with angiotensinogen, which then it cleaves to angiotensin 1. And then angiotensin 1 is cleaved to angiotensin 2 by this ACE enzyme. And then after that, angiotensin 2 goes on to stimulate the production of aldosterone, which then leads to an increased reabsorption rate of salt and a higher blood volume and blood pressure. And at this point, hopefully you're thinking about feedback loops. You're hopefully thinking to yourself, he's talked about these feedback loops in these other hormone axes. What about this one? And the answer is it's not quite as clear of a feedback loop as with the other two, but there are some feedback mechanisms in this Renin-Angiotensin-Aldosterone system. For instance, a spike in blood sodium levels actually suppresses the activity of renin that is in the plasma. In addition, juxtaglomerular cells can actually respond to increases in blood pressure by suppressing the release of renin, right? They have these stretch receptors in their membranes that are able to sense changes in blood pressure. And so what happens here is that through those stretch receptors, they're able to say, okay, the blood pressure is high. Let me suppress the cleavage of prorenin into renin. And as a result, they just secrete prorenin, which is inactive, right? It doesn't have the same activity as renin. So that was a bit of an introduction into the HPA, the HPG, and then the RAAS. And these are three hormone axes that you may see in some part come up on the MCAT. So I hope this podcast helped you understand them, and I hope it also helped you review some important concepts regarding hormones in the endocrine system. As always, thanks for listening to this episode of MCAT Basics. If you like what we do, leave us a review on iTunes. It helps us in the rankings, it helps more people reach us. And, tell your friend, tell your coworker, tell your neighbor, anybody who's studying for the MCAT. Hopefully they can use this as a resource that helps them.
Each episode of MCAT Basics is brought to you by Med School Coach. To access Med School Coach services, including MCAT tutoring and medical school admissions advising, visit our website at medschoolcoach.com. Good luck as you prepare for the MCAT, and we hope you tune in again next time.